We're looking forward to diving back into our learning and trying to understand this relationship between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer. As we said, it's a student-teacher relationship where Rabbi Eliezer is the great rabbi of the generation, and Rabbi Akiva is his student. And in the stories that we saw so far this week, the student beats the teacher. The student is the one. Rabbi Akiva is the one who's able to bring the rain in the Babylonian Talmud by reciting Avinu Malkeinu, just the two lines of Avinu Malkeinu. And in the Yerushalmi that we saw yesterday, just declares a fast and it works, as opposed to Rabbi Eliezer who declares a fast and it doesn't work. And then Rabbi Akiva told that story about, well, the only reason it worked for me is because I'm the chutzpahdik daughter. Rabbi Eliezer as the daughter who's kshera, well, that he wasn't answered because God just likes to listen to his pleas. Actually, the image of a chutzpahdik daughter as the leader of high holiday davening when you're saying the Avinu Malkeinu is kind of an interesting image to play around with. If you're going to map that onto our davening today, but that's the mashal, that's the parable that Rabbi Akiva tells. And the other piece that we've been looking at is this question of what is ma'avir al midotav, somebody who passes over their midot, somebody who passes over their I guess what we're understanding in context, their negative attributes, or as Rashi explained to us yesterday, the instinct to limdod, the instinct to measure and to size up other people. And if you're able to ma'avir, if you're able to pass over that, then over lo psha'av, then God will pass over your sins. So there's sort of like a mirroring of, if you can embody some form of, I'm going to be forgiving, I'm going to think about people without judging them, then God will also behave in that way. And Rabbi Akiva here seems to be the model of, if I behave in a certain way, then God is going to reciprocate, and that's sort of part of what's being played out in these stories. What I want to look at today is just a little bit further into the stories, especially on this theme of ma'avir al midotav, passing over your negative attributes or your instinct to measure, to size people up, and also the relationship of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, which has another famous set of stories that draw out that relationship. The story of the Yerushalmi that we looked at yesterday, and the chutzpahdik daughter and the kshera daughter. But I want to look at a description of Rabbi Eliezer that comes in Pirkei Avot, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is describing his 5 excellent students, and this is really the beginning of the rabbinic project. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is sort of, generation 1 after, let's say, Hillel and Shammai's generation 0. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, after the destruction, before the destruction, he has 5 students. One of them is Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus. That's our Rabbi Eliezer, and it describes in Pirkei Avot what is the nature of Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus. He is a bor seed she'eino me'abed tipa. He is a plastered cistern that never loses a drop. Now, in the context of metaphors for students, sort of what I always understood this to mean is he never forgets anything. He's like a great receptacle. Never losing a drop is a positive attribute, right? It's like, I contain everything that comes my way. And indeed, in other stories of Rabbi Eliezer, this is sort of the nature of his style of learning is, I only teach things that I receive from my teacher, and indeed, I never forget the things that come my way. But in the context of the stories that we're seeing here, it's, oh my gosh, he's the guy who never loses a drop of water, right? He's the one who holds in the flow. And in that way, it's sort of like the embodiment of the opposite of the guy you would want in the moment of drought, right? You don't want a guy who's known for never letting water flow. You would send in somebody who has the water flow out of him. He's contrasted with another of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's students, Rabbi Eliezer ben R, the last one on the list here, who is Ma'ayan Mitgaber. He is an overflowing spring. So you can see the water metaphor is being played out here. Rabbi Eliezer is the one who holds all the water and never lets any of it come down or flow. And Rabbi Eliezer ben R, who's his own interesting character, is that overflowing spring. He can't actually contain any of it, but the water is always flowing. And that's part of what we see here in terms of the nature of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, one of the places in which Rabbi Eliezer does let water flow is actually one of the most famous stories in the Talmud, one you may have had occasion to encounter, which is the story of the excommunication of Rabbi Eliezer. When Rabbi Eliezer is on one side of a debate and all the other rabbis are on the other side of the debate, and the debate is about whether a particular type of oven is pure or impure. Rabbi Eliezer says it's pure, and all the other rabbis say that it's impure, or it's susceptible to impurity. And then Rabbi Eliezer starts to argue his point, but arguing his point by sort of calling upon heaven to back him up. So if I'm right, let the tree jump out of the ground, and the tree jumps out of the ground. If I'm right, let the river flow backwards, and the river starts to flow backwards. If I'm right, let the walls of the Beit Midrash start to, crumble, and they start to lean in, but they don't go all the way. And then Rabbi Eliezer says, if I'm right, let a voice from heaven come out and say that I'm right. And indeed, a voice from heaven comes out and says the law is according to Rabbi Eliezer, which seems like the ultimate proof. But then famously, Rabbi Yeshua says, well, lo bashamayim, we don't listen to voices from heaven anymore. And the law goes according to the majority, even though it seems like Rabbi Eliezer is right in that he has God's approval for his conclusion. Now, that's the story that we're often taught. And then what happens after that is the tragic part of the story, which is the majority rules. Those rabbis then excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer. They say, you're no longer part of our Beit Midrash. They send him away, and they don't even tell him that they excommunicated him. So what we're going to pick up in the story is where the rabbis have excommunicated Rabbi Eliezer, and then they're scratching their head and saying, who's going to go tell Rabbi Eliezer that he's been excommunicated? And wouldn't you know it, it's going to be Rabbi Akiva, his trusted student, the one that we've seen in these stories. Okay, so let's just take a look at it. I'm scrolling on down to page 3. Okay, so they brought all the pure items that Rabbi Eliezer had declared pure and burned them. And then they took a vote and excommunicated him. So that's the deed. And then they say, who's going to go tell him? Who's the one who's going to go inform him that he's been excommunicated? Rabbi Akiva says, I will go and tell him, lest another person that's not fitting go and tell him and destroy the whole world. Okay? So Rabbi Akiva is, I am the only one who has the relationship with Rabbi Eliezer. So remember, we saw in yesterday's story that Rabbi Akiva tells a fantastical parable in which the kosher daughter isn't answered. Her prayers aren't answered because God loves to hear her pleas. And that's only in order to save the house of Rabbi Eliezer from being blasphemed. And now we see there actually is some motivation to blaspheme his house. And now Rabbi Akiva, sort of the fact that he's trying to defend Rabbi Eliezer is even more weighty in the context of the larger narrative in which he's going to be excommunicated, Rabbi Eliezer, that is. And Rabbi Akiva is the only one who's going to be able to communicate with him in this ban. So now let's find out what he does, and we're going to see the way in which water plays a role here in this story. And if you learn the story out of the regular printed editions of the Talmud, this is from the manuscript edition, which has a little bit of extra detail, which actually relates to the flowing of the water that we've been analyzing here. So what did he do? What did Rabbi Akiva do in order to inform Rabbi Eliezer that he's been excommunicated? He wore black and covered himself in black, removed his shoes, and went and sat at a distance from Rabbi Eliezer of 4 amot, 6 feet social distancing. That was the rule. How do you know that you're excommunicated? Nobody's coming close to you. So if you feel like rejected by society these days when you're socially distant, that's because it was like the actual standard. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva shows up, but he's dressed in a way and he's sitting in a way and behaving in a way that indicates that Rabbi Eliezer is excommunicated. And then, significant for us, V'zalgu einav d'ma'ot. His eyes flowed with tears. Rabbi Akiva is crying. Here again, he's embodying that rain. Remember from the very first story we saw, when everybody cries and the rain comes, there's some sort of flow that Rabbi Akiva has here, and he's expressing it in front of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says to him, Akiva, what's special about today? Notice he calls him Akiva, not Rabbi Akiva, because Akiva, he's his student, so he doesn't get the title. So tell me what's going on. Rabbi Akiva said, it seems to me that your friends or your colleagues are separated from you. So now what happens to Rabbi Eliezer? His eyes, afu zalgu einav dma'ot. Even his eyes start to flow with tears. So here's the guy who is borseed. He always contains the water. No drops ever flow. He's the guy who, when you daven for rain, the rain doesn't come. But in relationship with Rabbi Akiva, that's when he actually starts to cry. And he gets the message that he's been excommunicated. Now, what happens after? Remember, Rabbi Akiva says, if someone else goes, the world might be destroyed. I'm the only one who can get this job done. Indeed, later on, as the story continues, Rabbi Eliezer uses his eyes that now don't have water flowing out of them, but sort of returning to his natural state. It was so great on that day that every place that Rabbi Eliezer directed his eyes would burn. Miyad nisraf. Anything that Rabbi Eliezer looked at burned up. That's the opposite of water flowing from your eyes. He has this sort of standard resting place of Rabbi Eliezer is harshness, truth. I'm gonna tell it like it is, and that's sort of the fire element here. Whereas Rabbi Akiva is embodying more of a water element, something that flows, something that is life-giving, and in that way, Ma'avir al midotav, all these things that Rabbi Akiva embodies is all what we want God to embody in the prayers that we have on the high holidays. And we can see that this interaction between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer runs very deep. So it's not just like a snapshot of one day, these two, a rabbi and his students, have this interesting interaction around a drought, but rather this is a larger dynamic where Rabbi Akiva is both, he didn't vote against the excommunication and stop the excommunication, but he's still trying to hold on to the relationship with Rabbi Eliezer, even in the context of being part of the majority. And it's sort of a complicated connection that's being played out here. All of this is wrapped up in the Avinu Malkeinu writing and sort of adds a lot of narrative dimension to this prayer that we rattle off at the end of each Amida on high holidays. But I wanted to circle back to one last image around Ma'avir al midotav. Now we said again, Rabbi Akiva is Ma'avir al midotav. He passes over his instinct to measure and judge. Rabbi Eliezer does not pass over that instinct. He's Eno Ma'avir al midotav. I want to relate that to the way in which the humans who are running the show down here are in some ways mirroring the struggles of God above. And it's in a great little selection from the Talmud elsewhere, which asks the question, what does God daven in God's Amida? Like, of course, God davens the Amida. What, God isn't from? So God davens the Amida, but God can't say the same Amida that we say, because the Amida that we say is a whole bunch of requests to God to do something. But God is going to say something. So they're going to tell us a report of what God says in God's daily prayer. And the theme and the language is going to be resonant here. So what does God pray? My matzle, what does God pray? Rav Zucha Bar Tuvia says in the name of Rav, so we have a tradition in the name of Rav. This is what God says every day. Yehi ratzon milfanai, may it be my will, may it be the will before me, as opposed to Yehi ratzon milfanecha, may it be my will, sheyichbeshu rachamai ka'asai, that my mercy will conquer my anger, v'yagolu rachamai al midotai, and let my mercy override or sort of like roll over, like galim, like waves. Okay, let my mercy like sort of overwhelm my midot. Now you would say, what do you mean your midot? Aren't the midot the positive attributes of God? But no, clearly midot here is, like Rashi explains, that instinct that apparently God also has, limdod, to measure and to size up and to judge, right? So let my mercy override my instinct to judge. That's what God says every day. And I will behave with my children through the attribute of mercy, b'midat rachamim, and go above the letter of the law with them. And I will do lifnim mishur adin. If din is the way they should be judged sort of by the strict letter of the law. I'm going to go beyond the strict letter of the law. I'm going to go to the mercy side. And of course, that's the whole theme of Rosh Hashanah, is we're asking God to move from we saw last week in Ulatana Tukah, from the throne of judgment and truth to the throne of mercy. And so that's what God is hoping to do. May my mercy crash over like waves my instinct to judge. And that's how I think Rabbi Akiva, who embodies this attribute of Ma'avir al midotav, he overcomes the instinct to judge and to measure up. Then God brings the rain as a result of the mercy overcoming God's instinct to judge and to be angry. So again, what we have here is a whole variety of different metaphors in which the prayer leader is embodying the mode that we want God to treat us with, a sort of merciful mode, a one in which your instinct to size up and measure is overcome by your mercies. And that's part of the sort of underlying nature of this plea for Avinu Malkeinu. So tomorrow we're going to come together, look at the term, what does it mean to call God a father and a king? And in the meantime, I'm wishing everyone a Yom Tov.